Let's jump right in. If you're studying sociology, you know we constantly have to look past surface-level explanations. And that's exactly what we're doing in this explainer. Right out of the gate, we need to establish a core, undeniable thesis. Dowry violence in India is absolutely not some random cultural aberration, and it's not a simple interpersonal failing either. It is a highly predictable, systemic output. Today, we're ditching the emotional sensationalism you usually see in the media. Instead, we're going to rigorously unpack the actual architecture of this violence, looking at exactly how kinship systems, history, and economics interact to produce these devastating outcomes. Here is our roadmap for this analysis. We'll deconstruct the cultural myth, explore the kinship framework and the architecture of power, trace the colonial history, layer in intersectionality, and finally look at how women exercise agency within these tight structural limits.
So part 1, deconstructing the cultural myth.
We really have to start by clearing the air. The popular myth frames dowry violence as just bad people doing bad things, or even more problematically, it gets reduced to this trope of women oppressing women. But the sociological reality, it's entirely different. Dowry violence is the predictable output of intersecting structural forces. It's actually a system functioning exactly the way it was built to function. Moving to part 2, the kinship asymmetry framework. To truly understand the power dynamics at play here, we have to look at 2 specific sociological mechanisms. First up is hypergamy, which is the practice of marrying daughters into higher status families. What this does is permanently subordinate the bride's natal family. Now add exogamy to that, marrying outside of one's geography. When you do that, you physically sever the bride's support network. She's entering a new home with literally zero social capital. These mechanisms practically guarantee that the groom's family occupies a structurally superior position, which completely normalizes ongoing coercion. And the data illustrates this perfectly. The north-south divergence in mortality rates is not some cultural accident. It is a direct product of these contrasting kinship architectures. In North India, you have asymmetrical linear alliances that trap an isolated bride. And the tragic result? Exponentially higher dowry deaths. We're talking about states like UP recording over 2,600 in a single year. Now contrast that with South India. Down south, you see symmetrical, circular cross-cousin alliances. A woman given in one generation returns in the next. Because the bride maintains strong ties to her birth family, dowry deaths are in orders of magnitude lower, like Kerala, which recorded just 14. It's a stark reminder: structure dictates outcome.
Which brings us to part 3, the architecture of domination.
This is where we have to completely rethink a deeply entrenched stereotype, the supposedly evil mother-in-law. We have to view her violence not as interpersonal malice, but as institutional enforcement. It's constrained by what sociologist Dennis Kanyoti calls the patriarchal bargain. Think about it. She endured this exact same subjugation when she was a new bride, all on the promise that she would eventually inherit authority. So her harassment of a new daughter-in-law isn't an aberration. It's a highly rational defense of a monopoly position over household resources. She's just enforcing a system that gave her literally no other path to power. To fully grasp why this persists generation after generation, we look to Pierre Bourdieu's concept of symbolic violence. This happens when coercion is systematically validated by the community as, well, necessary instruction. The domination wears a mask. It's disguised as custom, as familial duty, and as respect for elders. And because everyone misrecognizes it as completely natural, it makes resistance structurally illegible. The perpetrator and the victim are both caught in the exact same illusion. Anthropologist Veena Das captures the incredibly dark interior dimension of this with her phrase, "the descent into the ordinary." It reveals how violence actually functions as the release of a lifetime of sanctioned pain forced through the only channel the structure allows. The mother-in-law is carrying decades of accumulated suffering from her own bride years, and the new daughter-in-law just becomes the site onto which that unprocessed wound is displaced. It becomes so tightly woven into the fabric of daily domestic life that it ceases to be recognized as violence at all. Let's look at how this evolved in part 4, colonial rupture and extraction. Get ready for a major shift in how we understand this history. Coercive dowry is actually a colonial invention. Yes, you heard that right. It is rooted in property law ruptures, not some unbroken ancient tradition. Before colonial rule, what we think of as dowry was primarily stridhan, a portable economic safety net controlled by the woman herself.
But in the 19th century, British land laws formally disinherited women by legally recognizing only male heads of household as property owners. Almost overnight, dowry mutated. It became a compensatory payment for accepting a newly created economic liability. Fast forward to the intense marriage market competition of the 1980s and 90s, and real dowry values spiked, cementing the ongoing coercive wealth transfer we see today.
Now consider the legal architecture, specifically Section 498 of the Indian Penal Code, and that really persistent popular narrative that women are just wildly misusing it. It presents a fascinating puzzle, but the empirical numbers absolutely shatter that myth. We see a massive 93% charge sheeting rate. That means police are finding the initial complaints highly substantive. Yet there's only a 14 to 18% conviction rate. So why the massive gap? Well, it proves that institutional bias, evidentiary collapse during agonizingly long proceedings, and immense family pressure are what actually suppress genuine convictions. It's not false reporting, it's a structural failure to convict.
Next up, Part 5. Caste, Class, and Intersectionality.
Take the concept of Sanskritization, theorized by M.N. Srinivasan. He documented how upwardly mobile lower caste and tribal communities actively transition away from historical bride price traditions and instead adopt upper caste dowry practices to claim higher social status. But here's the massive catch. Adopting Brahminical patriarchy without having the inherited wealth buffers of the upper castes creates a profoundly violent structural mismatch. The extreme economic strain of trying to keep up this appearance frequently collapses into intense frustration and ultimately violence against the bride. And when we talk about intersectionality, we absolutely must acknowledge the compounded vulnerability of Dalit women. They don't just face dowry violence, they face simultaneous caste-based violence. And these forces aren't just additive, they interact. The caste vulnerability actively amplifies the impunity of the perpetrators. This intersectionality means Dalit women face a qualitatively distinct and heightened form of violence that effectively blocks their access to legal remedies, which often results in total, systematic, institutional abandonment by the police. Finally, Part 6. Agency within structural limits. After everything we've discussed, we cannot make the analytical error of reducing these women to passive victims. Agency absolutely exists, even with an extreme constraint. Women are engaging in dynamic, empirically documented forms of structural pushback every single day. This includes what sociologist James Scott famously calls weapons of the weak, things like deliberate delays and selective compliance. But it also includes maintaining covert networks with their birth families, using the threat of legal literacy as actual leverage, tapping into NGO legal aid, and building genuine financial autonomy through rural self-help groups. These actions are crucial. They show exactly how women are incrementally dismantling the patriarchal architecture from the inside out. All of this analysis builds to a single critical challenge. How do we actually dismantle a deeply entrenched structural architecture of kinship and economic extraction rather than just trying to police individual behavior? Because as we've seen throughout this explainer, treating the interpersonal symptoms will never ever cure a system that is functioning exactly as it was designed to. Something to think about.